Good afternoon, and welcome to the second session of American University Center for Environmental Policy's webinars on decarbonization, pathways to a decarbonized economy and a more livable planet. We are going to address with a cast of experts today the issue of decarbonization from some sectoral approaches as opposed to looking at nation states as units. And the question is, what will it take to get to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050 to mitigate climate change and limit its effects to acceptable levels? Fears about a perceived trade-off between climate mitigation and economic development continue, but this webinar series seeks to move beyond that conceptualization of the problem and to understand how climate change can be dramatically slowed and the economy decarbonized without too much economic loss, and in fact with some economic gain along the way. So I think rather than going too much further in introduction, I think the best thing I can do is introduce our first speaker, Henri Waisman of the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations. He is a senior researcher with the IDDRI climate program in charge of activities on long-term emissions development trajectories. He's the coordinator of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project, which is a international project which is really tackling some of the hardest questions with relations to how exactly we can best proceed down this path in order to achieve the objectives that the world and the planet need. So really gives me great pleasure to thank our first speaker, who is appearing to us from the early evening in Europe to address long-term low emissions development strategies and the Paris Climate Agreement, insights from the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Initiative. I'll turn it over to Henri. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todd, and thanks you for the very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I will just share as a matter of introduction a few lessons from this Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative that we are running at IDDRI. I'd like to start with some lessons from the IPCC 1.5 report, because I think that this provides the concrete foundation for all the work that has to be done on deep decarbonization. Here, I've extracted a few of those messages that can be derived from this report. And the first one, which is not written here, but it's the elephant in the room, is if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement climate goals, there is at least one necessary condition that we need to be very clear about, that we need to reach global carbon neutrality. The report says between 2050 and 2070, just to give a range, but at least carbon neutrality is the objective. And that's what I will intend by deep decarbonization. Deep decarbonization means the pathways that can lead us towards global carbon neutrality towards the middle of the century. The IPCC analysis demonstrate that there are several of those pathways that could be imagined to reach global carbon neutrality, but there are a number of conditions that are anyway required. And those conditions involve systemic changes at an unprecedented scale for all the sectors and all the systems by 2050. And here, I will not enter into all the details, but that's, I think that justifies a lot why this session is about sectoral discussion, that what we need to do is to transform drastically the energy systems. Very clearly, we need zero emission electricity, no unabated coal can be left in the system, and even natural gas can be left only if carbon capture and storage is available. I know that another presenter will talk about that, so I'm not entering into the details. Industry needs to be changed, and we need to be clear that energy efficiency, although critical, is not enough, and that we need to envisage structural changes in processes and in the structure of production. Transport needs to be changed, and although technology zero emission vehicles are needed, we need also to consider modal shifts towards public transport, but also how to moderate mobility needs through urban infrastructure, behavioral changes, and land use needs to be changes in order to maximize carbon sinks while satisfying food demand. So basically, we're talking about massive changes in all the systems. And other few key messages that I'd like to highlight as an introduction here is that when we look at all these pathways, what appears clearly is that there is no silver bullet. It's not as if we could imagine one single solution that would get us on the way. Rather, deep decarbonization is about a combination of action and policies that should be well thought in order to achieve the goal. We'll come back to that later. We need to highlight also a very important feature of this IPCC report is that different mitigation pathways, so providing, delivering the global carbon neutrality, they have very different synergies and risks of trade-offs with sustainable development. And Todd, in his introduction, highlighted the need to imagine pathways towards global carbon neutrality that deliver benefits from the economic, and I would add socio-economic aspect. And that's indeed a critical question to recognize that not all the mitigation pathways are equivalent when it comes to assess their effect on sustainable development. The third key message, delaying action is a dead end. Reaching global carbon neutrality requires early emission reductions. And if we don't do that, we will be faced with choices that probably we don't want to in order to understand whether we want to actually reach global carbon neutrality or not. And finally, a final question, which I think is critical also to understand the dynamics of the Paris Agreement. Obviously, it's a country-driven process in the sense that countries are invited to make their contribution to the global effort, but international cooperation is a critical enabler for deep decarbonization, notably for developing countries. And what matters is to define this international cooperation in order to support the needs of individual countries to support their drastic changes towards the systemic changes that are required. Just to share a very quick introduction of the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative, not entering into any detail, obviously, but just to stress that the objective of this international initiative is to answer the how question. How countries can transform to 2050 consistently with both carbon neutrality and socioeconomic priorities. The way we work, so IDDRI is leading this international community, but we have in-country partners in a number of countries, notably most countries, Latin America, Africa, and many others. And here I stress that just to say that the country-driven approach to the deep decarbonization pathway is critical. And it starts from the acknowledgement that we need to take into account country circumstances in order to define global pathways, but also at the national level that can achieve the goal. The approach of the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative, it's based on the idea that we need to design deep decarbonization pathways, so these DDPs, thus pathways that describe the changes that need to happen in order to reach the global goal, in order to inform stakeholder engagement. And here, connecting the two topics, which are on the one hand, the analysis, but on the other hand, engaging in policy discussion. And a nice analysis is useless if it's not used to engage with actors of the real world. And that's really what we are doing with the DDP. And finally, I will not enter into any technical detail, but just wanted to stress that the approach is country-driven, as I mentioned, but we have a common pathway design framework. I will not enter into any detail, but just want to stress that this is fully described in a paper we published in 2019 in Nature Climate Change. I've put the reference here, and I'd be happy to answer any question there, but just just to stress that this common pathway design framework is what allows us to deliver global scale messages from this country analysis. Moving to a set of key results, key lessons that can be derived from the DDP analysis we've conducted in many countries since 2014. Basically, a few key messages include the acknowledgement that deep decarbonization is feasible. That's the first thing. It's feasible in all the contexts we've analyzed, and we've analyzed industrialized and emerging and developing countries. And in all these contexts, we find pathways that can reach global national deep decarbonization. The second very important message, and maybe as important message, is that this deep decarbonization can be articulated with socio-economic priorities. So we are not talking about selecting whether we want to reduce emission at the cost of sacrificing socio-economic goals, but it is possible to find pathways that achieve the key domestic socio-economic priorities as defined by the countries, together with a drastic reduction of emissions required by neutrality. The third thing, the third message is that this decarbonization that aligns emission reductions with socio-economic priorities requires systemic action on all pillars. And here, just want to stress that moderation of demand, efficiency, decarbonization of fuel, end-use fuel switching, and maximization of carbon sinks, so the main pillars of the decarbonization, it's not one or the other, it's all together. And that's why the main challenge lies, that we need to implement deep action on all these pillars in the country level in order to be able to reach the goal to align global national deep decarbonization with domestic socio-economic priorities. And the final lesson we've learned by looking at all these different countries is that although the main messages are common, so the main pillars on which we need to act are the same in all the countries, the way to achieve them and the way to implement them requires country-specific strategies. So the strategies that we'll be implementing in a country is not the same as the one that will have to be implemented in another, in order to take into account national circumstances, national specificities, for example, regarding opportunities and challenges, the technical potential, societal preferences, and any other specificity of the national context. So it's very important to take that into account when imagining what deep decarbonization means. I will go to my final slide just to share a few methodological lessons, how to investigate this question, and we'll see that we'll end up with a justification of this, this session. The first point I'd like to stress here that our experience shows that deep decarbonization requires a backcasting approach. So just to be clear, we need to start by the requirement for the long-term objective, the 2050 or even longer-term requirements to achieve global carbon neutrality, and to understand how to move from there to the present in order to inform the sequence of action. What we are talking about here is not marginal deviations from current trends, it's drastic transformation, and to understand them, we need to start by the scale of the transformations that need to be achieved. The second main message is that there is not one single route, even in a given country, to achieve deep decarbonization. There are several, and it's very important to explore them in order to ensure that we can provide a robust vision in a context of deep uncertainty. We need to acknowledge we don't have a crystal ball that can allow to predict the future, but we need to map different futures in order to understand the way the transformation can happen and can be adjusted in the course of this transition in order to achieve the goal. Third point I'd like to stress is the importance of transparent and detailed reporting. Basically, the role of this analysis is not necessarily only to give a normative vision of where we need to go, but it's very important also for it to be transparent and to be open, to open the box of the nature of the transformation as a key condition, notably to facilitate discussion with decision makers. We should not expect that the experts can tell what is the only good solution to the questions that are asked, but rather they can provide some aspects that need to be considered with real world actors in order to define pathways that can achieve the objectives. And the final one, which will make, I hope, a nice introduction to my to the other speakers in this introduction, that's one of the key messages from the DDP is that we need to conduct sectoral deep dives. Obviously, we are talking about an economy-wide transition, but sectoral deep dives are critical in order to open the box of the solution space. We need to understand all the levers on which we can act to transform each of these sectors and to inform engagement with real-world actors. It's not with a superficial analysis of each sector that we can do really this engagement with experts of the sector, with stakeholders engaged in this sector, but it's really only if we open this box that we can understand where the concrete conversation and where the concrete actions need to take place. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for your attention. Here are my contacts, and I'd be very happy to answer any question you may have, obviously, after when the discussion is on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Henri. That was a very good opening presentation, and the website is a marvelous one. So I do recommend that you go there. And I think we're gonna take up your challenge of the deep dives. I wanted to just say that indeed, according to the American Meteorological Association text on climate change, it seems that in mitigation, it seems that industry is accountable as a sector for about 29% of emissions, agriculture, forestry, and land use about 20%, buildings about 18%, transportation about 15%, other energy and power about 15%, waste and wastewater about 3%. So those are the main sectors. We are going to discuss several of those today, or rather experiences from several of those sectors. It would be hard to present a sort of purely data-driven overview. I think what we've sought instead is to get an impression from people who are doing pioneering research and applied work in each of these areas to present to us what that means to them and to their sector. So we're going to have several industry representatives speak at the 5th seminar in this series. This is only the 2nd one, so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves too much. But today, we would really be very appreciative, and thank you to Mark Thurber from joining us from the Walsh Group in Ecuador on the energy sector and his discussion on transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, insights from the ground in Ecuador. Thank you, Mark. Just to say another word about Mark, that he is manager of the Walsh Group, which is an environmental consulting firm that provides services to the natural resource and energy sectors, including oil and gas development and power generation in Ecuador and more broadly. He's worked with a broad spectrum of stakeholders from industry, government, banks, NGOs, communities, academic institutions, in developing consensus on how to manage and reduce impacts from large infrastructure projects. He knows Ecuador like few others, and knows the energy sector extremely well too. We're very pleased to have him today. Thanks for joining us also, Mark.
Good afternoon and good evening to everybody. Thank you for that very good introduction. And I'm going to be talking about decarbonization in Ecuador. Ecuador is a country that is oil producing, and oil is very important to the economy. It has been since the 1970s, and it's very entrenched in that industry, and it's a real challenge for Ecuador to find a pathway to sustainable energy production and a sustainable economy. Just in my opening slide, you can see a couple of slides on the left that show the oil development in the Amazon, and then subsidies that we have that have driven people to smuggle gas into Colombia, low oil prices. And then on the right, you can see some of the new renewable energy projects that are coming online, a solar project on the island of Isabela in Galapagos, and a wind project in Loja, and some small hydro project in the mountains. Ecuador is seeking to make this transition, but it's very difficult because of their dependence on oil revenues. Next slide. So I'll really be going through a case study, which I think is relevant for other developing countries. Ecuador is a middle-income country, other oil-producing countries. very high dependence on oil exports, 1/3 of the government budget. But it's important to know that oil development fueled growth and poverty reduction since the 1970s. There's a lot of criticism about oil in Ecuador and around the world and the damage it's done and the instability it's caused in the economy. It's caused impacts in Ecuador to the rainforests and also indigenous tribes. And we've also gotten caught up in this boom bust cycle, which I'll talk about, where spending goes up, and then when the price of oil goes down, it's very difficult to maintain those expenditures, and the country has gone into debt. It's important to talk about, what were the positive aspects of a carbon-based growth model, because there are positive aspects in terms of poverty reduction and just general economic growth. As we all know, between 72 and 81, we had oil prices and also high oil prices in between 2004 and 2014. In Ecuador, we saw dramatic changes, doubling of the public sector spending, which resulted in very measurable improvements in education. As you can see, healthcare, road building, infrastructure, rural electrification, land reform, and then also direct assistance to households in terms of cooking fuel, and also transportation subsidies for gasoline and diesel. And so these had a very dramatic positive impact on the poor of Ecuador, and Ecuador really was transformed during this time. But when prices of oil went down in the 1980s to the early 2000s, and also in this period, it's caused economic and political instability. We've had coups, we've had a lot of suffering. This is an example of how subsidies dramatically improve the lives of the poor. You look at in 1970, most households were cooking with wood or kerosene, which caused health impacts, also deforestation. Today, almost everybody's using LPG and a little bit of rise in electricity, which I'll talk about. This has been a major positive impact on the standard of living of Ecuadorians. So what are the failures of this carbon-based growth model? As I mentioned, a lot of increase in public sector spending, which is really unsustainable when the price of oil drops. Also, rent-seeking behavior. A lot of extra money around when the prices are high. One example of that, which is something you wouldn't expect, in the oil fields of Ecuador, in the jungle, you actually have indigenous groups that are moving next to oil facilities because they get benefits from those facilities, even though they're causing social and economic, social and environmental impacts, health impacts on those groups. A dependence on cheap subsidized fuels, which is a cost that is a total cost that's continuing to rise. And then damage to very sensitive ecosystems. In the case of Ecuador, we're in the jungle. And so primary rainforests, a lot of biodiversity, and also indigenous people who have been dramatically affected by the building of roads and displacement from their lands, and also contamination of their streams and soils. And then, as everywhere, urban air pollution, and then the contribution to global climate change. So what has Ecuador done in terms of moving towards decarbonization? The biggest factor is trying to get off of the dependence on oil exports. And so there's been a lot of effort to diversify the economy, especially in the agricultural sector, with cacao, chocolate, coffee, fair trade products, trying to diversify that export pie of the percentage of the oil that's actually being percentage of exports coming out of Ecuador. Also phasing out the expensive fuel subsidies, which were very important if you go back to the 1970s and 80s, but are less important now as Ecuador is a middle income country, but really become an entitlement issue for many people that don't really need those subsidies. And then this innovative program that was initiated about 10 years ago, which was a nature for carbon swap to leave oil on the ground. And then construction of sustainable energy projects, hydro, because we have mountains and a lot of rain, solar, we're on the equator, so we get a lot of good sun, and then wind in the mountains and the coastal areas. So a lot of information on the slide. I'll just kind of jump to the main point of it is that 11% of the government budget is directed towards fuel subsidies, which is very large. It's almost 2% of the GDP. Part of that is cooking gas, which I talked about earlier. It's extremely cheap. It's $1.60 for a 15 kilogram tank. And then transportation fuels, which are diesel and gasoline. In the case of transportation fuels, the subsidy for diesel is very important because it allows goods and people to move around and cheaply. Gasoline really is a regressive subsidy. It helps car owners. Removing these subsidies, even the ones that were not that are regressive, was very difficult. And during the time of the year, there have been lots of protests every time. Either gas, they tried to remove the gas subsidy, or the fuel subsidy. In 1999, we had a very serious set of protests about changing the gas fuels. There was a compromise, and while we're progressively removing the subsidies, particularly on gasoline, somewhat on diesel. And there's also a program to promote household electricity with induction stoves and gas heated water, etc. Let's see. Yeah, so this makes my point about kind of the subsidy trap that Ecuador has gotten into due to the oil income and the desire to reduce poverty. In the 70s, this subsidy for LPG was very important, but if you look at the data from 99, 2006, only 8% of the total subsidy actually reaches the poor. Most of it is going to wealthy people and the top percentages. And so we're basically subsidizing people who heat in their swimming pools or their small businesses, people that don't need that subsidy. Now, the nature for carbon swap was a very interesting initiative. It was basically, the concept was to leave known reserves that are inside of Yesi National Park if the European carbon emitters would pay for 50% of the oil reserves. And the idea was to protect biodiversity, reduce the carbon emissions from that oil, also protect tribes that have been suffering from the impacts from oil development, and also protect an uncontacted tribe that's also in that area. This had strong support from the president. It was a broad coalition from civil society, but in the end, the deal failed. And it really failed because Ecuador was concerned about energy sovereignty, that this natural resource would be locked up indefinitely or forever. And if the price of oil went higher, they wouldn't be able to access to it. And so it fell apart. And also the investors on the other side really wanted assurances that the oil would stay in the ground and the Ecuadorian government wouldn't give it. So it basically, it didn't go through, but it was a really good first step. And I think it's an interesting concept that I hope is revisited in the future. So in terms of sustainable energy projects, Ecuador is a very large hydroelectric sector, as many mountainous countries are. A lot of it's been untapped. It's sustainable, but there are also impacts from hydro, flooding of sensitive ecosystems, displacement of villages. Solar is, as we all know, the price of solar has come way down. And so Ecuador's, any equatorial country has great solar potential. And so we have several projects that will be coming online. And the impacts are minimal because they're actually taking over these old flower farms that have already contaminated soils from pesticides, et cetera. And then a little bit of wind in the Galapagos and also in some of the mountain passes. And then we're also pushing biofuels, which, I want to make the point that biofuels are not particularly sustainable. We have a large African palm production here. A lot of that is being directed towards biofuels. Most of it is exported like petroleum. And so we're kind of repeating that extractionist history with African palm. And currently we have 250,000 hectares that have been deforested due to biofuels. So what's the path forward for a petroleum producing country? The main thing that we need to do is we need to get off our dependence on petroleum and diversify the economy so that we're not relying on this income. And the worst thing for Ecuador in terms of this is high oil prices. When the prices go high, there's a lot more exploration, there's a lot more extraction of oil. Gradually eliminate the subsidies for carbon-based fuels while protecting the poor. That's very important, but eliminating the subsidies, more targeted subsidies for the poor, eliminating them for the people who don't need them. Targeted subsidies for electric use, because we have a lot of electric potential with hydro and the other sustainable wind and solar, and then incentives for companies to come in and build industrial scale solar, wind, and hydro projects with higher tariffs or longer power purchase agreements so that it encourages them to come in. And then this nature for carbon swap is really innovative and interesting, but it's nascent, and we really need to work on how to make that work for everybody. And then finally, lifestyle changes. It's just one little comment, and that during the pandemic, we can't drive our cars here for 3 days a week. And so people are buying these electric scooters and walking and bicycling. And so that's a very important change that's happening. So with that, I'll end my comments and I'll pass it back to Todd.
Thank you, Mark, for a good cross-sectional analysis of the energy sector in particular, also including some of the socioeconomic effects. And I think many of us on the panel would be glad that you also mentioned the sort of the non-redistributive effect of subsidies at present, which are definitely a big problem worldwide as well as in Ecuador. So thank you for that great introduction to a sort of sectoral approach to these questions, these big questions, cutting them into sectors. And so our next speaker is also going to address a sectoral discussion. We have Keira Havens of Pivot Bio, who is going to present Decarbonization in Agriculture, the structure of measuring non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. And we're very happy to have her today. She has been deeply involved in synthetic biology as a scientist, an entrepreneur, a communicator, and a thought leader. Her work has engaged all facets of the synthetic biology economy in pursuit of beautiful biotechnology, well-designed, elegant solutions to intractable problems. As a sustainability and public affairs manager, she's excited to be working with Pivot Bio to tell the story of the future of fertilizer. So again, we welcome you and we thank you for presenting another kind of impression from within the one of the sectors that are going to be so important for mitigation and for reaching decarbonization, the agriculture sector. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Todd. Hi, folks. I'm happy to be here. I am with Pivot Bio. I am the sustainability manager for that company, looking at what does our product do and why does it matter? And in the context of this discussion today, I'm going to be taking you on a journey through agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, zeroing in specifically on the non-greenhouse gas or the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, and why that's such a crucial problem to address. I'd also love for you to keep in mind, as I'm talking, the ways that the private sector can actually change some of the assumptions that we're working with when we think about the big picture here and how to affect structural change, like Henri mentioned earlier. I know only 2% of us have a close connection to a farmer these days, so agriculture is a pretty unfamiliar field. I'd encourage you to ask questions in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that as we go along to try and make sure we're all on the same page here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Oh, and it looks like we are out of presentation mode. Let me fix that. Perfect. So as I said, I'm with Pivot Bio, and we make microbes that fix nitrogen for cereal crops. This is going to be a turning point for fertilizer use across the world, as I'll explain throughout this presentation. First, I want to challenge you a little bit in how we're thinking about carbon and emissions from agriculture in particular. Agriculture does contribute, agricultural land use and forestry does contribute about 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But you'll see in this EPA graph that agriculture only takes up about 10% of that slice of the pie here in the US. And what's not included in this discussion of greenhouse gas emissions is actually the other side of the agricultural equation, the sink that agriculture can be for carbon dioxide, because plants photosynthesize, and photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sunlight and turns that into sugar and starches and materials for the plant to grow. So this complex figure on the right-hand side here posits a new language when we talk about carbon. And agriculture falls into the category they call living carbon, cycles where carbon flows through the system, producing durable goods, finding itself sequestered in materials like soil. So as we proceed through this discussion, remember that plants take carbon in from the atmosphere and that they are able to put that carbon into the ground and into functional forms that are useful for us. And that means agriculture, of all the industries, has the potential to be not just carbon neutral, but carbon positive in this terminology, taking what is essentially a waste product at this point in time from manufacturing activities and converting it into useful goods. So why do we need agriculture? It's a pretty basic question, right? And the crux of it is there's a lot of people and we all need to eat. There's going to be 10 billion people over the next 30 years, and there's a big gap there. We have to figure out how to produce enough calories to feed folks. And we also have to produce enough plant material to provide for various other bioeconomy needs, oils, raw materials. All of this is going to come from intensive production agriculture. But we're going to need 1 billion tons of biomass going forward. But intensive production agriculture relies on nitrogen. And right now we get nitrogen from the Haber-Bosch process. It's great. It lets us increase productivity up to double what we can normally produce. It is the reason we can support the population that we do and the population going forward. However, the Haber-Bosch process is a really intensive chemical process, and it contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions. Just the manufacturing process alone is about 1%. And then once you apply nitrogen, nitrogen's a really active element, and it moves around the environment very quickly, contributing to air quality and water quality issues, and also contributing to 1.5% or so of global greenhouse gas emissions. Nitrogen is a double-edged sword, and we need to address it directly because it has so much benefit and yet carries so much negative impact. So nitrogen management is an essential tool when it comes to decarbonization, because we're talking about one product holding a substantial portion of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. If we can tackle this problem, we can have a huge impact. But the solution has to create values, not just for the environment, but for the people that actually use nitrogen in the first place, the farmers. So let's talk a little bit about nitrogen. and what it means in terms of the carbon footprint of agriculture. On the left, you see a diagram using the GREET model, and it shows sort of the contributors to the carbon dioxide emitted by an acre of corn. The biggest section on that graph, the tallest bar, is nitrous oxide as emitted from nitrogen fertilizer. So this is a huge component. It can be up to half of the greenhouse gas emissions of an acre or bushel of corn. On the left, you'll see an excerpt from a Forbes article adapting a Leonard write-up, where he addresses the various aspects of agriculture that could be improved. And you'll see where the red arrow is that fertilizer management efficiency is one of the teeny tiniest sections there. So we have, on the one hand, fertilizer as a 50% of this greenhouse gas footprint, the biggest contributor. And on the other, the assumption that we can only mitigate that by a tiny amount. So Pivot Bio has stepped in to really get at that discrepancy and say, can we tackle the biggest emitter by a substantial amount that actually changes the way we grow and the way we cultivate. And this is something that the UN is really leaning into. Nitrogen is everywhere. It's in a variety of different forms, but it's essentially invisible. And so it's difficult to track. One of the only ways to get at this issue is to dive into the fertilizer question and address that directly. But here's the problem. Many of these proposed solutions, these proposed decarbonization avenues, are costly to the farmer. They involve risk, they involve finance. The only approach, particularly with fertilizer, that has been shown to add value for farmers is enhancing the efficiency of the fertilizer that they put down. So our job as a technology producer is to figure out, how do we go about building a new tool for farmers to address this issue in a way that doesn't cost them money or time. I would like to add that nitrous oxide is a particularly intractable greenhouse gas. You can see on the left-hand side here that fertilizer is a contributor. The non-greenhouse gases that ag produced are primarily nitrous oxide, and fertilizer accounts for about 40% of that. And you can see on the left-hand side from the same EPA report that the EPA only expects to be able to mitigate 3% of those emissions for the next 30 years. We don't have any tools to address this. Again, the only tool available to us is just not to use as much of it. And if fertilizer is the key to producing enough food and material for the world, that's going to be a really hard sell. So we are imagining the capacity to transition to a new nitrogen source. And that means we're working with biology for better crop nutrition. So Pivot Bio has tackled this nitrogen management problem head on, adjusting timing and application so that farmers have the capacity to give their plants nitrogen at the time the plant needs it before it becomes susceptible to loss, causing all of these environmental impacts. This is an example of synthetic nitrogen application happening before the plant even appears, before it even germinates. Wind, water can get to it, creating that evolution of nitrous oxide that contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions. But if you were to use a bacteria that can pull nitrogen from the air and apply it directly to the plant roots, essentially doing the work of your tractor and your factory and all of your manufacturing processes for you over the course of the growing season, what you end up is an alignment where the nitrogen the plant needs is available when it needs it, without the need for carbon-intensive manufacturing. And so that's exactly what we do. We work with microbes to overcome two main challenges. One is that there's already a lot of nitrogen in the field. And two is that nitrogen turns off this biological process. So we go ahead and remove sort of natural barriers to the nitrogen fixation. And we enable microbes to grow on the roots of corn crops right up next to the plant and produce nitrogen continuously throughout the growing season. This gives farmers the capacity to step away from synthetic nitrogen and towards a biological solution with lower carbon footprint. All right, so what happens when we commercialize these microbes and we bring them out to the field, as we've done over the last few years? Well, two big changes take place. This is our tagline, nitrogen starting point. The first is that we have a difference in manufacturing process. This is a schematic of the Haber-Bosch process, and you can see that for every ton of nitrogen that we produce for fertilizer, we also produce 3 tons of carbon dioxide. Well, when you're growing microbes, that changes. You're essentially brewing these guys at room temperature in little vats with some water and some sugar, and that's about it. You don't have massive influxes of petroleum, you don't have high heat and pressure. And so for every ton of nitrogen we produce, we actually are able to produce that, we're able to produce the microbes that make that nitrogen with 98% fewer greenhouse gas emissions on the manufacturing side. And similarly, when it comes to nitrogen loss, we're able to really address this factor as well, because our nitrogen doesn't just sit in the soil waiting to turn into lost nitrogen that affects air and water. Our nitrogen is produced over time. So if there is a weather event, it doesn't become nitrous oxide, or there's not enough of it, I suppose, to generate the big quantities of nitrous oxide that we see with traditional fertilizer. So manufacturing is actually less than half the story, and I just told you how we change that equation. This nitrogen loss is 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions that fertilizer is responsible for. And so when a farmer doesn't put down synthetic fertilizer because they're using a biological source of nitrogen, we can also avoid those loss emissions. And every ton of fertilizer displaced, you can think of it as just about as removing a car from the road. Now, agriculture is a massive global enterprise, and there are huge numbers of acres, 1.8 billion acres of cropland under cultivation right now. And so if we were to put our product across all the corn acres just in the US, not even globally, just in the US, and farmers reduced nitrogen as a result, we estimate that we could do the equivalent of take about 2 million cars off the road for just with this one product. And the reason we're able to have such a massive impact is because we stepped back and we asked, how do we tackle this problem efficiently and effectively, and with the tools that affect a structural change in the way farmers grow? So that's a thought that I'd like to leave you with, taking you all the way from carbon to nitrogen, back to carbon again. I'm excited for the discussion, and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Keira. That raises a lot of optimism, I think, that in fact decarbonization can be done in a way that is, extremely beneficial using technological advances. And we appreciate your presentation of sort of the agriculture sector initially as well, and sort of the how your product fits into the bigger issue and the bigger question. So thanks for tracking that, and we look forward to getting some more questions and answers. If people want to submit as we go into the question and answer area, feel free to do that. We have one more sectoral presentation, and then we're going to, if you recall, the discussion of the sectors as well as the discussion of carbon sinks at the very beginning in Henri's presentation. We will have a presentation on the transportation sector by Andrew Losos of the World Bank, who will talk about decarbonizing maritime transport. And then we will go into a presentation by Simon Nicholson of American University on carbon removal and deep decarbonization. So finishing up on this discussion of how sectoral experiences in addressing decarbonization, it is a pleasure to introduce Andrew Losos, who is a senior sustainable transport specialist at the World Bank. He has expertise in climate mitigation and adaptation from the transport perspective and has 15 years of experience in international climate change policy. He's been working in the African continent and presently leads the World Bank's efforts to decarbonize maritime transport and improve sustainability of ships and ports, and is the co-chair of the Getting to Zero Coalition's Global Opportunities Workstream. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation as well.
Great, thank you, Todd. I hope everyone can see my presentation by now. Please tell me if you have any technical issues on your end. Hello, everyone. As Todd said, my name is Andrew Losos. I'm Senior Sustainable Transport Specialist at the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. I'm an engineer, I'm a former naval officer, and I've been working in the maritime and climate change and sustainable transport sector in various different ways for about 25 years. Today, I'm going to talk to you about decarbonization in the transport sector. I'm going to focus on the maritime subsector of transport, though I'll try to give you a bit of an overview at the beginning because the sector is just so large and the subject matter is so wide-ranging that it's not possible to treat it all in 12 minutes. But I'm happy to talk more, and if we can have other opportunities like this, we can discuss other particular aspects. Transport is a sector. It's one of the sectors that emits greenhouse gas emissions. It's transforming rapidly. The world of transport is changing due to electrification. I believe one of the previous speakers mentioned electromobility in the context of Ecuador, electrification, the use of the internet to reshape the flows of goods and people that move across the surface of this blue marble in which we live is really transforming what we think of as transportation. Shipping is part of that. It's transforming too. The seaborne freight business has been growing very quickly. Even before COVID, it was one of the fastest growing modes of transport. And there was a dip in seaborne freight when COVID hit, but it's quickly picked up again since. Unlike many other sectors of transportation, the developing world, the lower and middle income countries have a commanding market position in shipping, which is a little different than others. And it's a major and fast growing emitter of greenhouse gases, which I'll explain to you in a moment. So the maritime mode will play a pivotal role in achieving integrated and sustainable development in healthy oceans, or that blue economy approach that we would like to see, broadly speaking. We're going to talk today about the decarbonization aspect of that. This is just to give you a bit of an overview. There are many challenges in sustainability, environmentally and socially, that the shipping and the port sector face. These are the challenges that are associated with the movement of our Nikes and our toothbrushes and our iPhones between the factories in China or India or Asia or Africa, wherever they may be made, to where we live, in whichever corner of the world we find ourselves over usually very long distances. Oil pollution, plastics, hull coating, water pollution, air emissions, oil spills, coastal erosion, dredging and tailings, many things. But today, let's just talk about climate change, decarbonization, and the zero carbon fuel supply that might go with that. So decarbonization in the transport sector. Transport is a big part of the carbon pie. You can see here, I will switch to laser pointer mode so that I can show you the transport wedge is 14%. These numbers from the US EPA. If you look in terms of primary energy usage, transport comes up closer to about 20% of the world's primary energy use. And the problem is that in transport, we have not made much progress on switching away from carbon intensive fuel supply. 95% of the world's transport energy comes from petroleum, either gasoline or diesel, more or less, and variations thereof. And since 1970, emissions from transport have doubled, more than doubled, and are increasing at a rate faster than any other energy end use sector as we humans decide that we really want to move around this planet. In shipping, to focus on shipping as a portion of this, I'll try to interest you in the emissions there associated there too, and can see what is being done. Currently, maritime transport is almost entirely powered by something called heavy fuel oil, or HFO. It's a fossil fuel, very high carbon, high sulfur, and highly viscous residual fuel that is more or less the black residue from the bottom of the refining or the cracking tower in the oil refinery. It looks like tar until you heat it, so it doesn't even flow until it's heated beyond room temperature to be used in an engine, for example. And that's about 80% of the energy mix in the shipping sector. The other 21% is more or less other fossil fuels like marine diesel oil, which is lighter. You can see it here on the left. LNG, liquefied natural gas, which is a gas but compressed and cooled to a liquid state. And one thing that's notable is so far we don't yet have a significant proportion of zero carbon bunker fuels. By the way, the term bunker fuel, I use it a lot. It refers to shipping fuels, the fuel that ships burn. So when you talk about bunker fuels, we're talking about shipping fuel. So how big is the problem? Here's the 2015 distribution of total CO2 equivalent emissions in millions of metric tons. If shipping were a country, it would be the 6th largest emitter in the world. About 2 to 3%, give or take, of global emissions would be right here between Japan and Germany, just shy of 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent. So it's a substantial amount, and it could be, with the growth that's expected by mid-century 2050, that could grow from 2 or 3% of global emissions to 10% or more, even with a 50% reduction in the industry, just because the other sectors would decarbonize more aggressively. So it's a substantial contribution. We love to talk about energy efficiency in this sector, in many sectors, but in shipping, energy efficiency increases have not reduced CO2 emissions in an absolute sense at all. That quote is from the International Council on Clean Transportation, as is this graph. You can see on the left side of this graph, the yellow bars showing the change in CO2 intensity. So percentage increase in efficiency or decrease, let's say, in emissions per ton mile traveled by these different classes of general cargo, chemical tankers, cruise ships, oil tankers, ferries, bulk carriers, and container vessels. They've all made improvements in energy efficiency. They've all decreased their emissions per unit of economic activity. But what you see on the right-hand side in these green bars is overall the increasing emissions. You know, some of them are up around 8 and 9% increase in the 2013 to 2015 period. So energy efficiency not only will not save us, it will barely make a dent in the business as usual case. So we have a dual challenge. We got to do two things. We need technical measures to reduce the release of CO2, and we need policy measures to shape behavior in favor of adoption of those technical measures. Easily said, not so easily done. Let's talk about the policy situation for a brief moment. The only organization, since shipping is an international activity and most of it takes place in international waters outside the jurisdiction of any nation state, it's got a particular governance structure and a very strange and archaic governance problem. The only world body that governs international shipping is the specialized agency of the United Nations, a bit like the World Bank, called the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. They are the single institution organization that has regulatory authority over international shipping. The good news is the IMO has declared a greenhouse gas reduction target, and you see the one-sentence summary of it here on the screen. It really has three main points: to peak GHG emissions from international shipping as soon as possible, that's one, and to reduce the total annual GHG emissions by at least 50% by 2050 compared to 2008, that's two. It's an absolute target, not a relative one, important to remember. And at the same time, pursuing efforts towards phasing them out entirely. This one is looser, but it's an aspirational goal to go beyond the 50%. Okay, sounds nice. Where are we? One of my earlier colleagues who spoke before me spoke about a backcasting approach. Here's what the emissions curve for shipping has looked like historically up till today. So here's the historical curve. We're in the 2021 time period right now. And business as usual climbs towards a gradual and devastating asymptote if we let it go unchecked. The 50% ambition outlined in the IMO strategy that I just explained to you corresponds to this blue curve here, in which by 2050 we'd be down around 500 megatons, and slow decrease after that due to technical improvements and so on. What we really need, though, is to do much better. If we want to meet the Paris Agreement targets, which I presume most of us do, we will need to do something much more like this green trajectory here between 2030, 2035, down to essentially zero by 2050. And there you can see the relative total carbon budgets of these different approaches. Business as usual is 100 gigatons of accumulated carbon emissions. The minimum ambition is 40, and the maximum is a little below 30. So that's what we need to do. There's a sense of urgency because in this industry, there's a long capital life cycle, so action needs to be taken now. The vessels that we build last for 20 or 30 years, and 2050 is 20 or 30 years from now. So it needs to be done very quickly. The IMO has given itself until 2023 from the setting of their 2018 target to adopt final policy measures and begin making GHG reductions. Rapid action is essential because 2023 is literally tomorrow. With a very long lifespan, the time of the capital investments in the ports and the ships and the energy infrastructure laying behind all of that, we need to do it now. What needs to happen in practical terms? What have we got to do? We have to shift the energy basis of the industry. From HFO, we have to phase out the use of heavy fuel oil. There are going to be zero carbon fuels that will come to replace that in an energy transition of the industry. Will they be green or blue? Will they be ammonia or hydrogen? What will they be? There are a lot of debates going on right now, and I will present to you the perspective that we have from the World Bank. A lot of this will be coming out in a report that we're planning to release in about a month's time. So what are the options? There are biofuels. Biofuels are a possibility. A couple of the previous speakers have talked about biofuels. There are significant concerns about the sustainability of biofuels. Basically, they risk being constrained by the supply of sustainable biomass. And cross-sectoral competition is also important because to do biomass sustainably, we would need a significant technological breakthrough in aquatic biomass production, and we don't have it. It doesn't appear to be on the horizon either. And the other problem we have with zero carbon biofuels, or at least biofuel production of this kind, is it won't be very useful for the shipping sector because other sectors that have fewer options like air transport are likely to buy up biofuels and drive the price up, making it uneconomical for shipping. What's another thing that we can do? We can produce hydrogen and ammonia, and we can do that in a number of ways. What really matters is the input source of energy. The previous speaker, Ms. Havens, spoke about the Haber-Bosch process, which was a much more detailed exposition of that than I will give you now. But that is also part of the consideration here if we're going to produce ammonia. What really matters is where does the initial energy come from? Does it come from non-biogenic renewable energy, which is what we would hope to have it come from? Or does it come from natural gas, which might be possible in a transition phase, depending on how well we can capture and store the carbon associated with that. You have green renewable energy drives electrolysis of water, giving you hydrogen, which you can use either directly as a fuel, because hydrogen can be used directly as a fuel, though it has limitations, or as an input to the Haber-Bosch process, where you would use more renewable energy, hopefully to overcome some of the energetic constraints that Ms. Havens outlined for us, to then produce ammonia. And we call it green ammonia if it's coming from non-biogenic renewable energy, and blue ammonia if the source is natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. And finally, synthetic carbon-based fuels. This is a process whereby direct air capture of carbon from the atmosphere is combined with hydrogenation, hydrogen produced from the previous section of this diagram that I showed you, to more or less reproduce carbon fuels, but with the zero net release of carbon, because you first extract the carbon from the air, create a synthetic fuel, and then re-emit the same carbon when it's burned, but that is likely to be less competitive in terms of cost. So overall, we think ammonia is likely to be the most probable solution for shipping anyway, because even though hydrogen is also appealing, ammonia uses lower onboard storage space because it has a higher energy density. It has cost benefits related to lower flammability, less demanding cooling requirements. It can be stored around -33°C as opposed to hydrogen, which requires cryogenic storage of -235 or so. The cons are that ammonia is toxic and it's a bit dangerous to manage and to handle, though there are management measures in place. Hydrogen is not as toxic. It is not corrosive, but it's explosive. Anyone who's heard of the Hindenburg accident knows what that means. It is less energy dense, and as I said, it requires cryogenic storage. So the adoption and implementation of these measures seem to be more readily achievable with hydrogen. I'm running short on time. I want to run you through a little bit about how much would we need. This diagram shows you how much area of the Sahara Desert would we need to convert to solar energy production worldwide if we were to meet 100% of the energy demand to create that much ammonia or hydrogen for the shipping industry by 2050. The high case meaning the high demand case for 2050, or the low case. So this gives you a sort of upper and lower bound of how much energy would be required. It looks like quite a large area, but that would of course be distributed over the whole planet. So you're looking at something that would be distributed among ports. How much will that cost? Between 2030 and 2050, at least $1 trillion in investment is needed to decarbonize shipping. That depends. We have 1 trillion here to decarbonize by 2070. If you recall, I told you we probably need to decarbonize more by 2050. But if we take a less ambitious goal and we use steam methane reformation, meaning use of natural gas to produce hydrogen with carbon capture and sequestration, the low cost is around $1 trillion. To use fully the same timeline, but fully using green energy and electrolysis, you're looking at about 1.4 trillion. Now, if we're more ambitious and we want to decarbonize by 2050, they increase in commensurate ratio. With natural gas helping out, you start at 1.4 trillion, but to do everything as greenly, in as green a manner as possible, you're up around 1.8, 1.9, closer to $2 trillion. And to put that in context for you, the annual global investment in energy, broadly defined in 2018, was about 1.85 trillion US dollars just in 1 year. So it's a sort of the equivalent of 1 year of all the world's spending on energy altogether. It's not an insignificant amount. So that's just to give you a taste of the size of the investment that's needed. I'm going to wrap it up with you for you with a quotation that I like to use. It is when we all play safe that we create a world of utmost insecurity. It is when we all play safe that fatality will lead us to our doom. I like this quote because even in the face of the climate emergency we now face as a species and as a planet, we are all still playing safe. Not all, maybe. It feels like we could be under some kind of a spell that is hard to break. The second half of the quote is, "It is in the dark shade of courage alone that the spell can be broken." This was Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who was referring to Middle East peace at the time, but I think this problem is at least as pressing as that. We need to think big, we need to be bold. Science is telling us that there's little time left to make a correction. How are we going to do that? We're going to do it by taking decisive action in each country and in each sector, as we're discussing here today. This is one where decisive action is needed, and soon. I hope we can find it within us to enter the dark shade of courage, and for shipping at least, do what needs to be done to break the spell. That's all I've got for you today. I'm sorry that I ran over a little bit in my time. Here's my contact information, which I hope will be shared after the session is over, so that we can discuss further if we want. And I look forward to question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for ending with that call to action, and also for helping us make concrete the daunting general goal of decarbonization, which I think part of the idea today is to really focus on concrete ways, right? When you take small steps, or when you learn what small steps are being taken, not that these are small steps, but the total is daunting, but your concrete presentation and including some of the graphs about sort of where maritime shipping stands with relation to countries as a source of emissions, and the ambition gap between aspirations of the IMO and sort of the Paris Agreement or I guess business as usual, help point out how some of the issues we've been studying with regard to countries also exist with regard to sectors. So thank you very much for that presentation. And I think, having shown in 3 cases how some of the sectors are pioneering some solutions, we would go now to Professor Simon Nicholson of American University, who can help us understand some of the carbon sinks that are being used in a new way to help address the problem of climate change. We heard a little bit from a couple of our earlier speakers about the use of plants as carbon sinks and sort of natural carbon sinks, but let's turn to Dr. Nicholson, who can give us some further perspectives on carbon removal and deep decarbonization. He is a professor of international relations at the School for International Service at American University. He has published extensively, including a range of books and articles and policy papers on global environmental governance, global food politics, and the politics of emerging technologies. including climate engineering and carbon removal technologies. He's the founder or co-founder of the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment and the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. He is also most recently the first and founding director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity at American University. Simon, we thank you also very much for joining us to help concretize carbon sinks and to sort of speak to us about what that means in more concrete terms as we unpack decarbonization. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Todd. Thank you. And nice to be with you all. Thanks to my colleagues at the Center for Environmental Policy at American University for the invitation. I will be brief. It's hard, Todd, to be at the end of such a rich set of presentations, and so I think the most humane thing I can do is get through this quickly so we can get to questions. I'm going to make 3 points, if I can work out how to do so. There we go. First point, carbon removal is necessary. So deeply decarbonizing, that is taking the greenhouse gas emissions from a particular corporation or industry all the way to zero, is not alone now going to be enough to prevent the world blowing through critical climate thresholds. What we've learned from the science over the past couple of years is that in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions all the way to zero, as rapidly as possible, it's going to be necessary to draw large amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere over the course of the century and put that carbon dioxide into storage. So that's point one, and I'll expand on that point in a moment. The second point, though, is that not all forms of carbon removal are created equal. We need to get this right. The work of the Institute at American University, the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy, is focused on the assessment and promotion of sustainable carbon removal. And so I'll speak briefly about what that means. And then finally, if we take the sectoral lens, which is the invitation of the panel today, the aim at the sectoral level, all the way down to the company level and all the way then up to the country or global level, needs to be the right sizing of carbon removal within a full climate response portfolio. As we heard from Henri in the first presentation, there is no silver bullet now when it comes to thinking about climate response. We need to be thinking about portfolios of response options and making sure that we have the right sorts of responses working in tandem. So to expand on that first point, this idea that carbon removal is necessary, I'll start in the same place that Henri did with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on the 1.5 degree target out of the Paris Agreement. What was made abundantly clear by that report is that carbon removal will be necessary to avoid the crossing of critical climate thresholds. This chart is complex, but just to break it down, what it's suggesting is that there are lots of different futures available to us as human beings as we're thinking about climate change response. All of them, if we're really concerned about climate change impacts, require getting to zero in terms of emissions as quickly as possible. But there is going to be a necessary role either for carbon removal to draw emissions out of the atmosphere that are in there in a dangerous fashion, or to clean up the residual mess that is made when certain industries are unable to fully decarbonize. So here are 4 different pathways. Everything below that zero line there is a removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and putting of those greenhouse gases into storage. From the 1.5 report, as Henri mentioned, it's critical that the world gets to net zero around 2050. Net zero means a balancing of emissions and removals by sinks. All of the pathways required massive removals by sinks on the order of 100 to 1,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide over the 21st century. A gigaton of carbon dioxide is 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The last point I want to say here on carbon removal being necessary is just to point out the scale of the enterprise. The IPCC, the chief scientific body that gives us an overview of what's going on in the climate system, tells us, based on their modeling, that 100 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide will need to be removed over the course of the century, recognizing that about 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere every year, about 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent if you take account of other greenhouse gases. So take a yearly emission, each year down the road, pull most of those emissions back out of the atmosphere and do something with them. That's the challenge that's tied to carbon removal, as an addition to emissions abatement as the chief decarbonization strategy. The second point then, not all forms of carbon removal are created equal. There are lots of different potential ways to do what the IPCC and other scientists are asking for, this removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. This chart comes from a paper from my American University colleague David Morrow and others, looking at the range of different options that are on the table at the moment as we think about the carbon removal landscape. Starting on the left-hand side with so-called natural climate solutions, as many in the civil society sphere talk about them, all the way to more engineered or mechanical forms of carbon removal on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we have things like growing trees in particular fashion, regenerative farming, perhaps there's a room for the sorts of technological options that Keira spoke about in her presentation, in addition to regenerative farming practices. A set of options that are all about trying to take the growth of biological systems, drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as plants grow, for instance, and then taking the CO2 from the atmosphere into biological storage. On the right-hand side of this chart, we have, again, more technological or engineered options. Things like direct air capture, which was mentioned by Andrew in his presentation. Direct air capture is about using a mechanical or chemical membrane to separate carbon dioxide directly from the open atmosphere. That carbon dioxide could be directed, as in Andrew's presentation, into the development of synthetic fuels, or could be directed underground into long-term geologic storage. If carbon dioxide from the atmosphere would turn into a fuel, that would reduce the overall amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, maybe all the way to zero, but to actually reduce atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide actually has to be pulled out of the atmosphere and put into long-term storage. That's the carbon removal challenge. Lots of other options on the slide that I could speak about with more time, but that just gives you a quick snapshot. The final point I want to make, if we're thinking about the sectoral lens, again, which is the invitation here on this panel, we need to be thinking about right-sizing within sectors and across sectors, across the full carbon removal portfolio. We're seeing a lot of net zero target setting now starting to take place. We're seeing companies come up with net zero targets, companies ranging from Microsoft through Stripe and others when we're looking at the computing sphere, United when we're thinking about transportation, lots of other corporations coming up with their own net zero pledges, all the way up to countries now saying we want to be net zero by a certain date. We've been tracking these net zero pledges through the Institute. There's a link to the corporate action tracker that we have. And what we see is that companies, for instance, are starting to get a pretty good grasp on what decarbonization means for their operations in terms of moving towards renewable forms of energy, and in terms of getting more efficiencies out of the sorts of processes that are at the core of their businesses. But the carbon removal component, which is going to be essential for most businesses, is still very hand-wavy in the pledges that are being made. And so what we've been trying to push companies to do, and we can take this analysis up to the sectoral level, is to be much clearer about the role carbon removal might or must play in meeting a net zero target. The reason that I say corporations and most of the business practices will need to have carbon removal is because, pick a business like Microsoft, if they're running gigantic servers, maybe they can use renewable energy for most of the work that those servers do, but there will be certain parts of the business operation or certain parts of the grid that they tie into for a long time, which will not be based on renewables. And so there's going to be some residual emissions coming from operations for which carbon removal is likely to be essential. I dropped the slide in actually as Andrew was talking, just because the UN Environment Programme picked up the role of carbon removal in the shipping, transportation industry and in aviation in the most recent emissions gap report. And as we're thinking about the sectoral lens, this is instructive. The business as usual pathway, which Andrew spoke to, if transportation from shipping and aviation was to continue along those business as usual pathways, then between 60 and 220% of the available carbon space by mid-century would be chewed up just by shipping and aviation. Right, so business as usual is unsustainable, and what we heard from Andrew's presentation is we need to bend that business as usual curve down to zero. But when we overlay these lines on the chart here, the blue-green lines, which are a representation of the earlier chart that I showed you, these kind of pathways into the future, there are going to have to be, across the full economy, negative emissions, that is the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. Where are those negative emissions going to come from? From a sectoral perspective, even if the shipping industry can get most of the way to zero by the sorts of processes that Andrew spoke about, is the shipping industry going to be responsible then for also trying to develop carbon removal options somewhere in the economy to clean up the residual emissions from shipping, either just in a given year or historically, right? This is a big puzzle as we look at the sectoral challenges, and also as we think about sectors in relation to each other economy-wide. Is it that, as a policy question, are other sectors going to have to devote more deeply into carbon removal as a kind of subsidy in carbon terms, say, to the shipping industry? The question is, where is the carbon removal going to come from? As we're asking those sorts of questions, I'll finish this with some high-level principles that are important as we think about carbon removal and its place alongside other forms of climate response. This again is from work that my colleague David Morrow at American University has been doing. Number one, don't forget the long game. Work has to start now on carbon removal options, even as we're thinking about a larger role for carbon removal later in the century. Right? It's going to take a long time to develop the infrastructure, the sorts of understandings that are needed if carbon removal is going to work at any scale. Number two, the assessment of carbon removal options can't just be about dollars per ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere. It's got to be about environmental, social, political, and other factors as well. And we're building sustainability metrics at American University to take account of that point. Number three, split, don't lump. Don't think about carbon removal as one big thing. Think about particular options in particular places used by particular people to meet particular climate and social ends. That's critical in our thinking. And finally, don't bet it all on being right. This stuff just might not work. So carbon removal is not an answer that can be dangled over the horizon to fix all of our climate ills. Carbon removal at best will be just a small slice of the full set of things that need to be done to avoid large-scale climate risk. It could be that most carbon removal options don't pan out. And so even if we're banking on some amount of carbon removal, we also need to be thinking about a plan B. What do we do if carbon removal doesn't materialize? That's it from me, Todd. Thanks for the opportunity to come speak with you all.
Thank you so much, Simon, for helping us contextualize another complex part of decarbonization and for considering a sort of subsidy role for sectors if they're unable to completely decarbonize, and raising these interesting questions of who's going to help solve the problem with you know, sort of carbon removal. And I also appreciate your split, don't lump number three, because I think that summarizes well, in part, sort of the presentations, which is small pieces of what is being done in the full picture. We can't address the full picture comprehensively, each of us, but thank you for sort of helping us conceive of how to address this piece by piece. Thank you very much. And I before we run out of time, would like to open up the floor for at least a few questions to all of our panelists. We want to thank you, and these were all very interesting presentations, which sort of illuminated how pathways can be brought into addressing these complex problems bit by bit. So just a few questions. I mean, I want to start with a question, which was sort of a provocation for the panel. I'm going to just ask each of the panelists to address one set of questions. I'm going to go through several, and just please, you know, keep in mind the ones you'd like to answer. But I think the first one is just, you've all presented sort of some of the low-hanging fruit, that is products you're working on, areas that you think will deliver maximum benefit for the effort. I wonder, in a general sense, what those seem to be from the Decarbonization Pathways Project, and also from each of the sectors. And with regard to, carbon removal, what are the most promising practical applications that you think will have the biggest effect most quickly? Okay, so that's one question. Another question comes from a student, a good question, which is, we know that climate change is not a single solution issue, and that carbon majors and institutions need to be held accountable on the road to carbon neutrality. However, her question is about change on the individual level. What is the single most effective thing consumers can do? And again, I mean, this is kind of a trap, because we also want to hold governments and sectors accountable. We don't want to just have to, recycle plastic straws. We need to address big issues. But that said, I mean, how can individuals address this? Other questions? A question on agriculture and nitrogen. How much nitrogen dioxide do you find the systems that use your microbial intervention emit? We know that plants with high nitrogen fixation rates leak nitrogen into the soil, which can also lead to high rates of denitrification. The point you made about coupling N supply and plant N demand spatially and temporally makes sense, but there will still be NO2 production. How much nitrogen dioxide production do you see in systems where you are using your technology? Okay, I guess that's a pretty specific question, but if you want to answer that, Keira, also thank you and feel free. Other questions may emerge, but I think for now, I will turn it back to you, just with a request, everyone take just a few minutes, and also just to thank everybody who joined us today, and to state that our next webinar is on April 8th from 5:30 to 7 p.m. You can check the website, and we will be talking about decarbonization from a national perspective rather than a sectoral one. Anyway, thank you so much, and turning back to the panel, if you maybe could answer in the order of presentation, or I guess however you want. Thank you.
Well, since there was a specific one for me, I'll just go ahead and run through all three of them real quick. To the nitrous oxide question, the IPCC actually doesn't attribute biological nitrogen fixation with any nitrous oxide evolution as part of that process. Where that nitrous oxide evolution comes from is from the retention of nitrogen-rich materials in the soil. So our hypothesis right now is that because the microbes are working in close proximity with the plant, the nitrogen they produce is used by the plant, and it doesn't stick around long enough to become part of that nitrous oxide emissions count. And we're of course running experiments right now to gather that, but we don't have a full data set to present at this point in time. That's our working hypothesis. As far as what individuals can do, this is going to be an individual answer from me. I think electing the politicians that talk about climate change and encouraging them to talk about climate change is the way to go, because this is big systemic work that needs to get done. And that low-hanging fruit, well, that's pretty easy. I'm focusing on it in my day-to-day work, right? I think agriculture and working with biology is a huge signpost for us as people building new systems and developing new systems, considering how biology manages resources and uses them is where I think a lot of attention and energy should be focused.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Sure, I'll make a comment about the oil and gas industry. I'll start with a story. I was in Calgary 15 years ago and at an environmental professional conference with about 10,000 people, and there was complete denial about climate change, complete denial. And a couple of years ago, I was in Norway, and the head of the Society of Petroleum Engineers got up and basically said, this is a problem we need to start dealing with now. we're behind the curve. Europe is ahead of the curve in terms of the oil companies. The US companies are behind the curve. And so I think the transition that we need to see with the oil and gas industry, which is happening a bit in Europe, is that they transform from oil and gas companies to energy companies. And when that starts happening, we'll see, political will, economics, everything kind of pushing this along. The oil and gas industry is an extremely powerful industry, and until they make that shift, it's going to be really hard to move this along politically.
So yeah, call your electeds.
Thank you very much. Sorry, anyone else? Comments from anyone else?
Just very quick comments. Just to the low-hanging fruit, I guess the question I'd like to stress is the low-hanging fruits of today are not necessarily those of tomorrow. Just to pick the obvious example that probably everyone has in mind, if you had asked someone of the industry whether solar energy would be a solution, 15 years ago, they would have said, yes, maybe eventually it would take 5% of the electricity production, maybe 10. Today, it's profitable compared to most of the sources. So basically, the vision is different. And I think what is critical is that the decisions that are taken today are not based on the assessment of the low-hanging fruits of today, but are based on what we can expect be the solutions of tomorrow. And I think it's really critical because if we take this narrow perspective, we'll only do marginal deviations from current trends and will never achieve the structural transformation that are required. Second comment I'd like to make about what consumers can do. We could imagine there are a number of things that are possible. Just one obvious example that comes to mind, you can eat less meat, at least when you are living in an industrialized country where you eat too much meat in average, you may eat less meat. So there are a number of things that you can change. But one thing that is very striking, that most of the things that consumers can do depend actually on good coordination of actions among different actors. I will not oppose consumers with institutions and with business and with the public authorities. What matters is to make sure that there is a convergence. Just to pick an obvious example, basically what you could say is, obviously for our daily transport, we should all use bikes or public transport or whatever is a low carbon solution. But it's not true that it's possible for everyone to do that, or at least it depends on where you live, where you work, what are the infrastructure that are provided to you. And this is something that goes beyond, obviously, what individual consumers can do. So what we're talking about when talking about these structural changes is actually good cooperation between what different actors can do, and what we need is good consultation between these different actors to make it possible for consumers to take the actions, but to create the conditions to do that. So that's really what we are talking about, and to create these solutions for the future, but taking into account the role of all the different players, not opposing them, because otherwise we'll never make it.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Andrew?
Yes. Okay. On the, I think all of the answers to all of these are kind of connected. How can individuals help? One of the problems with climate change is that it is largely an invisible problem. I mean, we start to see fires in California, and we see floods, and we see melting ice caps and so on, but it's very indirect. What consumers would need to be able to do is to make the invisible visible. Things like asking for labeling of goods to know the carbon footprint of the things that you consume. Henri was kind of saying that about meat, for example. Meat has a pretty hefty carbon price tag attached to it, but a lot of people don't know that. And if we were able to have regulation whereby we knew the carbon footprint of the things that we were consuming, then it might help. And you could have your family financial budget, and you could have your family carbon budget, and those things would be possible to do. So we will need to, but what does an individual do in that case? You can't create that yourself, but others have said it. You need to pressure your government to create those things, and your government needs to be accountable for its actions on domestic regulation, which is not really my province to talk about, but it also needs to be accountable for what it does internationally. Do you know what your government is doing, how it's voting at the International Maritime Organization on what is being done to decarbonize shipping? Probably not. Many of us don't, but it's something that if you knew, you might want to write to your elected representative to do something about, because you know, I'm presuming you care about the carbon footprint of the pair of Nikes that you just bought that came across on a ship, and then what was the fuel of that vessel, and so on. The low-hanging fruit, a couple of people have alluded to this. This is, I liked what Henri said, because the low-hanging fruit changes all the time, isn't it? And we can't satisfy ourselves only with saying that we need to take voluntary action to get the low-hanging fruit. I think the way forward, really, and if you think of it in the abstract sense, is for governments to rule either individually or through their collective bodies like the International Maritime Organization, and make regulation that becomes mandatory. And then within that regulation, you have to offer the industry in question and the economic sectors affected, you have to offer them a way out, a compliance route that starts gradually and then goes upward. But that's where they start to seize the low-hanging fruit first, knowing that they will then have to seize the higher hanging fruit at some point. And that's how it's got to ramp up in that, right? We can't only stick with the lower hanging fruit, or we're all going to starve. So that would be my feeling on that. I mean, the speaker before me was talking about Calgary and the oil and gas industry. You know, as a Canadian, this one is pretty close to home for me. But the oil and gas industry should realize that they can be a part of the solution too. I mean, in my presentation, I talked about ways that natural gas can be a transition, or can be a feedstock that helps this transition to a green energy system that we all want to see. And it would be really great if we could bring industries like that one into the tent as allies rather than opponents. So that is sort of how I see it on those two. And there was one other question, I don't know if others saw it, that was asked in the Q&A box about by one of your students, Todd, about how if major multinational corporations adopt newer fuel technologies but the smaller actors get left behind, then how would this depress overall progress and emissions reductions across the country? Just to summarize, I responded to that by text, but this is an essential question in any kind of regulation. And what, in our case, if they're talking about the shipping case, we need the international regulatory body, the IMO, to make a level playing field using regulation that applies equally to all, so that no one can escape, one. And then you need to have a progressive or redistributive system which helps the smaller players not to be left behind because of their financial disadvantage relative to the ones with deeper pockets. So that is all part of the regulatory discussion and consultation process and crafting process that would need to happen. But that's also the thing that forces those low-hanging fruit to be taken and then move towards the higher ones. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. All right, and I think I want to just retool the metaphor of the low-hanging fruit and just say, it sounds like what we need to do is shake the tree now, and then we need to shine light on all the fruit, and then talk about what the lower hanging fruit are going to be in 20 years, and then take the rest right after that. If that works a little better. I asked Simon if he has any final comments, and also, yes, thank you, Andrew, for addressing a question in the already answered group, because Simon has one too that I didn't raise before, which is that one CDR option you included is enhanced weathering. What would it take to implement enhanced weathering at a scale by 2050? Any idea about the level of investment that would be required? With adequate investment, what levels of removal would we plausibly achieve on an annual basis? And any other comments that you would like to address, Simon? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I responded to that question by pointing to a National Academy of Sciences study from the US context, which came out a couple of years ago and gives US investments in each of those different potential carbon removal options on the order of a few hundreds of millions by mid-century. It would tell us a lot about what's possible on carbon removal. There's also private industry stepping up now on things like enhanced mineralization. There's a group called Project Vesta, which is spending some millions of dollars on a pilot project to look at the grinding up of olivine, which is a way to encourage enhanced mineralization. That's part of the low-hanging fruit, is just to investigate these different pathways and understand what's there, even if to take them off the table, right? And the other big thing on the carbon removal side is to make sure that we keep current living systems intact, not just for carbon removal and the work of sinks, but for all kinds of other good reasons. That's the work that we wanted to be involved with now. And then on the individual action side, just amen to all of the comments that have gone before. It's a trap to think of ourselves as individual consumers when it comes to climate action. We need to think of ourselves as connected citizens. That's step one. right? And that means, as Keira pointed out, voting, but it also means that the things that Andrew and Henri and Mark talked about as well, just getting involved, making sure there's transparency, making sure that, say, when we go to our supermarkets, not just vote with your dollar, but work with other people to make sure the stuff that needs to be on the supermarket shelves is there, right? Those are political acts. And Todd, thanks for this, man. This is a great set of presentations. I've really enjoyed learning from everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And with that, I just want to thank you all again. The tape, the video and audio tape of this presentation will be on the website of the Center for Environmental Policy, and I will send it to all of the presenters with our thanks. And we very much appreciate your imperative to go for the low-hanging fruit and get a large stepladder and shine the light for the future fruit as well. And let's change the seasons. Let's rattle those trees. Okay, so I'm sorry I started with the low-hanging fruit. That was a lazy metaphor from the past, but we need to move forward, darn it. So let's do that. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and we'll see you soon. Have a great day and the great rest of your evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.